So this lecture is subduction and talking a bit about Sumatra, but there's so much to say, right? And you guys are very knowledgeable, so I can only say a few things. But what I'll do is just talk a bit about the micro-atolls and then how they're used for 1935 earthquake and also 1833. And then I'll talk a little bit about the 2004 earthquake from the GPS. So kind of talking about the source, the slip, and in a way to compare with the Japanese earthquake. And then I'll end with this really exciting outcome of these super cycles that has been determined from the study of the corals from the micro-atolls. So just to remind you, we've already been talking about this, so this is a repetition, but this idea that interseismically, we have this locked interface, and so it's pulling, it's pulling part of the upper plate down and lifts the other part of the upper plate. So it depends where you are. Different things happen. So interseismically, in general, the forearc goes down because these islands are really so far out towards the trench. And then the Honshu coast and Alaskan forests rise interseismically, but they subside coseismically, and the forearc rises. So this is the basic model. And it's important to keep in mind this simple earthquake cycle model. So I showed this a little bit before, but these are earthquake-killed forest that was subsided 2 meters in 1964. And so these trees, they don't like to be in the ocean. And so when they subside, they are killed. And there also shows this flat area is another bench that shows subsidence about 800 years ago. And that's from here, so showing in this area coseismic subsidence. So we can use trees, but the big thing that has really been revolutionary is the corals from here. And so we talked about these when we did our geodesy lecture, because these are kind of natural geodesy, this Porites coral. And so you have here at LIPI, one of the basically world experts of coral is Danny. And so the idea is that, let me go to here to our movie. Oh, I guess I have to show. So I showed this before, but it's quite useful to remember. So the idea, remember, is that coral grows and it doesn't like to be dry. It doesn't like to be in the air. And so it's growing, and the highest level of survival is just the highest point on the coral that's alive. So as soon as it hits the water level, then it stops growing up and it grows to the side. So if we lower the water level, which means that we lower sea level, which means that actually the coral was lifted, it looks like HLS went down. We see this kind of killing of this upper part of the coral. And then this is some subsidence, so we lower the coral, so sea level appears to rise, and now the coral can grow up again. And then it has to grow sideways. Now we have an uplift event. And now we're going back up, we're subsiding. So this is a really nice, steady subsidence, right? And so if we just check where we are, if we're on in Sumatra, this steady subsidence is what we expect here interseismically in the forearc. So it's just loading, loading, loading. And is there going to be an earthquake? Boom. So there was a big emergency event. So that means that the coral was lifted completely out of the ocean and it's killed. And so we can study these changes. There would be one earthquake, a second earthquake, and a third one. These are small ones because they didn't cause that much emergence, but then there was a big one nearby that caused the emergence. So that's the model that has been developed. That's so powerful. The reason why it's powerful is because it's very accurate in time. It's also good for both the interseismic and the coseismic. Most of our methods that we have only tell us about, let's say, the coseismic, but we have a very hard time with this interseismic part. So the coral is so useful. So here, for example, is one example of just basically steady submergence. So interseismic straining, just simple case. So we've talked about, we see this, so this basic idea, in general, the emergence is earthquakes because of that position where the forearc is, and then we see the strain accumulation, the steady subsidence or submergence between the earthquakes. And here's an example of, starting here and remember, what makes this also really effective is that the geochronology, they use a uranium-thorium disequilibrium approach. It's quite precise, so you can see just a few years of uncertainty, and that helps us anchor where we are, and then it's like tree rings. Then we can compare different corals to get a master record, and then date much better than any radiocarbon, for example. And so we see, there's this. You see this little kill. This dark means that there was a dead coral. So there was a small emergence event right around there, close to 1935. That's this one. And then we continued to submerge until 1960s, and you see this is that death level, an emergence event in the 60s, and then another death in the late 1970s right here, and then a few more small ones. So this is so useful for reading the elevation history of this coral. So this shows from Danny's PhD an example of a coral, a big coral. Look how big it is, from 1700 to 1935. So 200 years of record, continuous. And so he can show subsidence, earthquake. Subsidence, earthquake. Subsidence is 1833. We'll come back to. And so there are these small subsidence events, which mean they're relatively small vertical displacements, probably from far away earthquakes. So we're not immediately above the earthquake. We're kind of around the edge of it, but we still get a little bit of subsidence. And then 1935 was enough. It was 56 centimeters, so it lifted the whole coral out of the water and killed it. Well, and then it could continue to subside, so maybe it would try to come back alive later, but this was the main emergence event, and that was right below the coral, so the signal of emergence was large. And this is from one of his papers, just showing kind of the simple example of this coral here that had been up this high, was alive, and then there was an emergence event, and so the sea level dropped to as much as 90 centimeters, and then subsidence continued. That would be this here, and so we have a new coral growing out to 2000 when he sampled it. So he's even maybe seen some interesting precursory activity. So you wonder if these are foreshocks or other earthquakes in that same source area. And then you see, this is the 1935 earthquake, and then maybe some post-seismic signal, kind of rapid post-seismic, and then it goes back to some kind of background submergence. The one thing that he does find is 1962, there's a killing level in the coral. And this is interesting because he attributes this to a slow earthquake. Because in the 1960s, we would have known if there were a magnitude 7 earthquake. But there was no record of that earthquake. And so, and these subduction zones, we know there are these aseismic patches, and so that means they can sometimes have a real significant slip, but don't generate a lot of seismic energy. And so this is, to me, quite impressive to see such a subtle feature like a aseismic slip event in the coral. And that's totally amazing. So just to kind of make that comment. So any questions about this case? This 1935 is, they say, it's kind of a simple example. So here's what they if you remember from our discussion from Coulomb, we can try to, if you have, I've shown the case of one coral, from one place, but if we have multiple corals moving that are distributed, especially in the direction down dip, they will sense different magnitudes of uplift and subsidence depending on where they are. And so Danny was able to fit this record of uplift or subsidence with a dislocation model of a little bit of slip, but then deep slip of 4 centimeters per year was the main thing. And so he could fit these data quite well for the interseismic period. And then in the coseismic, so for 1935, there's a 2.3 meter slip on the interface that causes this uplift, like that 90 centimeters that he saw there. So it's important to show how they're using these mechanical models, the dislocation models, as the way to interpret what the individual corals are showing. And it's all consistent with these interseismic and coseismic displacements on the subduction interface. So the next one is from actually before Danny published, but one of the other people who worked on this, her name was Judy Zachariasen, and she did some of the earlier work, although there's even earlier than this. There's a C98 paper, and these guys, Taylor and Edwards, were the ones who were really knowledgeable about the coral and how to date the coral. But then Terry especially recognized the power of using it to study the Sumatran system, and he kind of picked it up. And so his students really did some impressive work. So Judy worked on 1833, which is in this area. And again, she was exploiting the corals that are around these Four-Arc Islands. So here she shows significant emergence event in 1833. And so here you see the growth of the coral, and then this really kind of rapid growth, so showing maybe rapid subsidence, and then emergence. And you see the error, so they can't be sure if they only have the geochronology. So the U series dating, uranium thorium dating, she takes a little piece, this black thing, and she dates it in the lab. So she gets 1788 plus or minus 10. So then she propagates, she counts through, and so by the time she gets to here, she's at 1841 plus or minus 11. So it's not quite perfect, but then they used historic records, so they know there was a big earthquake in 1833 in the region from written records. So then they can say, well, okay, that was it. And so that's how we can anchor the record to the annual. But it's obviously going to be challenging for paleoseismologically because you don't have that independent age control. But it's still not too bad if you're plus or minus 10 years paleoseismically, because even as we discussed for C14, you're lucky if the radiocarbon age is plus or minus 20 or plus or minus 30 years. And then when you calibrate it, as we showed in general, it gets worse. It's wider, and the calendar age is not quite as precise. So she did this study on a number of different corals from different places, and so she shows, this is again what's so revolutionary about this work, is this very nice steady submergence showing interseismic, and then 1.6 meters, 1.13, 1.8, 1.77, and 0.88. So one thing that they had to do is they because the corals were lifted so much out of the water, they all died, and many of them did. So there was no really good sense of exactly how far they lifted. And so what they had to do was to take this more modern subsidence rate and project it back. That's why there's this error here. And so they use that then to get this 1.13, like plus or minus 0.16. So it was, it's not perfect in this case because it had so much emergence that they died, and so we didn't see them, kind of recovering here. So with that information, then again, she uses a dislocation model and this is kind of just a two-dimensional one, perpendicular to the coast. So here's the trench, and these corals with these coseismic uplift magnitudes, she needs 13 meters of slip on the subduction interface to get this 1 to 2 meters of uplift where they are. So it was a big event, 1833. And then she even speculates, well, if you have 13 meters of slip and the down dip rate, so the convergence is like 67 millimeters a year, but it's oblique. So if you just take the down dip rate, it's about 50 millimeters a year. So 50 millimeters a year takes something like 265 years to recover the 13 meters of slip. So she does a very simple estimate for recurrence interval, 265 years. So, so that's for this 1833 patch, which has subsequently had some some large events, but probably not complete failures of that surface in 2005 and 2007. So, comments? Okay, so let's switch over to the, what I was just saying is this zone down here, the 1833 earthquake broke this area, but that zone started to break again in 2007 and 2000. But you see the failure is not complete. It's not a complete rupture of the whole interface. It's just small parts. So there's still a lot to rupture. And so this is what I think everyone's really afraid of, right, for Sumatra. And so hopefully everyone's planning as best they can. So let's go to 2004 earthquake. So there's so much to say about 2004. The one thing I pulled was just the GPS data, this paper that uses GPS data to infer what happened. And so this is this Mohammed Klieh paper, and so this is about coseismic slip and after slip of the great Sumatra Andaman earthquake. And so there's continuous GPS, so that's the red. That's like what we saw, the Japanese network is continuous, and the U.S. Plate Boundary Observatory Network is continuous, and there's some continuous now in Indonesia, right? There was a few here, but the rest of these are campaign, which means that they set up the GPS receiver for a day over the benchmark, come back a year later, do it again. And in this case, they went after the earthquake, and the displacements were very large. So this is 2-meter vector. So some of these are going 5 or 6 meters or more. And I think they also did, they measured it right after the earthquake, but then they went back and they measured again a few days after the earthquake and a month after the earthquake. So they were able to get the after slip to sort of see what the fault was doing as it continued to adjust after the earthquake. So that's really one of the powerful parts of this paper. And then there's vertical. So they also could, because GPS is not very good in the vertical, but when you have 2 meters of signal, you can measure that with GPS. So red is up, blue is down. So these Nicobar Islands went down, but much of the Andamans went up. So here's their best model. So they spend a lot of time in this paper exploring the best way to interpret the data. And so this is a dislocation type model. So it's just like what we did with Coulomb, but instead of having a single rectangle, they have many rectangles. So each one of these little circles is color-coded by the amount of slip, but it's not really a circle, it's a square, it's a rectangular model. So they grid the interface up with many small patches that are a few kilometers on the side, and then they do an inversion, so they find the best fitting slip model to explain the displacement field that was measured. So the observations are the yellow lines, and then the models are black. And this is coseismic, so it's just after the earthquake, as far as they could be sure. No, the red is coseismic, the yellow is coseismic plus 30 days. And so I think the point was that the continuous GPS, all the red, because it was continuous, they could get the displacements immediately. But it took as much as 30 days to get out to measure all the stations, and so it was coseismic plus 30 days. But anyway, their best model for the coseismic then is this one here. And so you can see they have as much as 20 meters of slip in some patches. And they have, but it's pretty long compared to Tohoku. And I don't have the scale, but I think Tohoku would be maybe, a third or a half the size of this earthquake in terms of the horizontal extent. And then if you remember, the peak slip was like 50 meters, right, in Tohoku, but here they're only getting 20. Now, you could argue, well, if you had a seafloor geodesy in Sumatra, maybe there was higher slip that we just can't see because they only have on land, they only have GPS from the islands. So this is, maybe there's more, but this is what they came up with. So then but there was significant coseismic motion. So these show so now if you just don't include the coseismic motions, and so after the earthquake, and this is the usefulness of the continuous GPS, it's a bit noisy, but in 5 days they see some continued motion of these stations. And so you can see these kind of typical, they come kind of exponential decrease in rate. So this is just late stage, it's adjustment on the fault interface right after the earthquake. And what you can see, what's important is that it's mostly less than a meter or two, but it's deep. It's on the down dip end of the rupture. So look where these guys are relative to this. So like Nicobar, it's like under Nicobar, whereas most of the coseismic is above Nicobar, right? So if this is the coseismic patch, the interseismic patch is down dip that slipped. This is commonly seen in earthquakes, that the main shock occurs and it kind of drives stress down into the down dip end of the fault, and that will continue to move for some time. So that's an interesting thing to see there. And that was just 5 days of post-seismic. And then 30 days, so they just can use a few stations. But by 30 days of post-seismic motion, you can see that some parts of the fault continue to move as much as 10 more meters. And so this is another 8.7 equivalent of moment that's aseismic, post-seismic deformation. So in my view, that's quite an interesting result. It's not the only time it's ever been seen. We often see this, but it's a well-imaged part of the earthquake cycle, and it shows that our simple models of coseismic, interseismic are too simple, that there is a post-seismic phase which helps to relax some more of the stress that's along the interface and especially down dip. So that's the end of 2004. Now I'm going to do the earthquake cycle back to coral. Okay, so this is a paper that Carrie C. wrote in 2008 that's really, I think, pretty amazing. So here's the Four Islands. And so around the islands, they have the corals, and they've studied them and have them pretty well dated. And so they say 4 emergence episodes. And so what you can see, like in 1380, there's this site with, more than 0.5. This one's 1381, 1 meter. And then it looks like in 1350, there were some 3.2 and so on. So then they reconstruct, like 1685 had these measurements in blue, and then 1606 has those. And as you see, as we come closer to the present, our ability to characterize these events improves. So in 1797, there's some event that happens under the islands. And then 1833, we've already talked about. That was the Zachariasen study. She had pretty good control on it. And so then also we could measure in 2007 these earthquakes, and so the blue and green show 8.4 and 7.9. So these 2 earthquakes, and so you see the magnitudes of emergence are between around 1 meter, and so that's similar to some of these earlier events, but some of them are bigger, like the 1833 has 1.7, 1.5, 2.5. So 1833 was bigger in its displacement or emergence than 2007. That's an important thing to see immediately. So then so there's a lot in this figure. So here's just first the map. And so this map shows Sumatra, and then the forearc, and then these colored areas show the subsurface extent of those earthquakes on the subduction interface, and the darker areas which show more high moment release. And so this Mentawai patch then is the one that was thought to have maybe broken in 1833. So here's what is really amazing. So there's A, B, and C. These are sites. So A is Bulasat. So that's, where's A? Here's B. I guess it's Bulasat is here. And then Simanganya and Sikichi. So these 3 places. And so here's the C is here, and M there, and B is here. And so what they show then, this is time from 1300 to now versus relative sea level. And so remember, we see this, the relative sea level increasing means interseismic submergence. And then we have these earthquakes, like this one here in the 1300s, and that causes emergence. And then interseismic, And then there's some small ones, and then boom, big one in 16 something. And then we go up, and then boom, boom, and then 1833 is the big one. And then we go up. So what they say is that these are super cycles. And what that means is that there's the main cycle is the big earthquakes, which is the time between these major emergence events. But then what's important, and maybe is the basis of their forecast for an earthquake, is that before these big earthquakes, we have smaller ones. So you see this here at this site. And then same before 1833, there were several more moderate earthquakes, like this 1797, which was maybe a little bit larger in the south. But they were preceding by as much as a few decades this big earthquake, which was 1833. And so what he says and what they suggest is that what's scary is that the 2007 earthquakes may be like these little ones. And so they're anticipating a big earthquake to come in the near future, in the coming decades, on that Mentawai patch. And here's then the model of the slip. That would be kind of the integrated slip on the fault surface. So this is kind of like distance southeast to northwest. This would be through the patch. And what they're saying, this line here is the total accumulated slip since 1833, and as much as 8 meters have accumulated given a 50 millimeter a year slip rate. And 2007 released some of that slip, which would mean stress accumulated, but there's a lot more slip that remains to be released. And so it's this big slip release that is the big earthquake that would be coming. So in my view, this is a really spectacular outcome because it's really only using the coral, which is some natural thing we can access, and we can go back in time to 1300 and we can see this really rich behavior of the subduction interface at that location and use it to forecast a coming earthquake. So it's amazing, I think, that he did it. And there are, of course, many assumptions in there, but it's impressive to me, and I think shows us what you can do with the paleoseismology when you have the right conditions, which is basically the corals and the Faroe Islands.